Welcome to the Harber Show. This is part 2 of our special 2-part series with Ambassador and General Douglas Lute. Doug, thanks again for being here.
Oh, good to be here.
Hey, my pleasure. Of course, you were the permanent representative to NATO. You are a retired Army Lieutenant General, former assistant to President George W. Bush. And I guess the list could go on, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you.
And not embarrass you. Yeah, one of the things that we didn't talk about in part 1, and I'm really interested in, is just the security process, the national security process in the White House when you were involved, and what's going on these days under this administration. Tell me about the differences.
So I've seen the national security decision-making process. So this is the process that plays out typically in the White House. More specifically, typically in the Situation Room inside on the ground floor of the White House under 2 different administrations, and 2 different administrations that were very, very different. So I was with President Bush's administration for the last 18 months of his 8-year term, and then for the first 4.5 years under President Obama. And in both cases dealing with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So a total of 6 years across 2 administrations and 2 wars. I've seen it work best when the team of decision makers, so this is the very top of our government, so Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor typically chairs this process, which is a series of meetings, right? The intelligence community is represented, and then other departments as needed. Sometimes the Department of Justice is present, Department of Commerce, and Treasury, you can imagine. So the cast changes a bit, or depending on the issue at hand. But I've seen it work best when that team brought into the Situation Room considers itself a real team. And that any rivalries or bureaucratic disputes are set aside in the interest of trying to present to the president the best possible array of national security options. This requires a couple things. First of all, it requires a national security advisor who's willing to sort of ride herd on this team and make sure that everyone feels heard, that options are discussed freely and openly, that this isn't happening behind someone's back, and that there's a sense of transparency and openness, collaboration. So leadership by the National Security Advisor is important. But it also counts, and this is perhaps more difficult to engineer. It requires a degree of personal trust and respect among the participants around the table. In fact, they seldom actually agree on every single topic at hand, every single topic being considered. That's fine. The system accounts for disagreements. But it works best, the process works best, when you have respect across that table in the Situation Room. And I think in recent history, we've had examples where you can see those qualities of good national security, effective national security decision-making in place, but we've also seen some examples where they've been absent. The American people get the best possible product, the president gets the best possible decision-making options when the system works right.
So when it comes to that group and its presentation of options, one of the things that fascinates me is the divide between, it seems, the president and almost all the other agencies when it comes to Russia. President Trump clearly believes that it's important for him to have a good personal relationship with Vladimir Putin, despite whatever Russia might be doing. How do you explain that?
Well, I really can't explain specifically to your question President Trump's approach, but I think more broadly, the American approach, even at the height of the Cold War, where we were locked in sort of military stalemate, looking across the Iron Curtain at one another with conventional forces, theater nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons. Each side had some 30,000 nuclear weapons pointed at one another in the period of the Cold War. Even during that period, right, we found space and we found the need to talk to Russia. So one part of the President Trump approach that I think is appropriate and reasonable is that there should be topics which we can talk to Russia about. nuclear arms control would be near the top of my list, right? We still are the two largest nuclear weapons powers in the world, with each between 6,000 and 7,000 nuclear weapons. That's an enormous destructive capacity that needs to be managed and needs to provide each to the other a predictable set of standards for these nuclear arsenals. So that should be reasonably high on our list, and it should be something we can talk about. But we should not go into any of these conversations with wild enthusiasm. I mean, Putin's Russia requires an external enemy, requires an external bogeyman, which helps Putin rally the Russian people, and more important, the Russian national security apparatus and the oligarchs who actually control the levers of power in Russia, helped Putin rally them around his policies. So if Putin didn't have an enemy in the United States and an enemy in NATO, he would create one because he needs it for self-preservation. And that's his first national interest. So there's a reason to talk to Russia. I think there are areas in which we should talk to Russia: counterterrorism, nuclear arsenals, and so forth. But we should do so with our eyes wide open.
Do you see any path globally for a nuclear-free world?
Not in the near term, because, I mean, a couple recent indicators, right? I mean, first of all, the administration has found the Russian side in violation of a Cold War era treaty, the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is a treaty signed in the late 80s that disallowed a whole category of nuclear missiles, nuclear armed missiles in Europe. So these are sort of intermediate range. On our side, they were all based in Europe. Russia's side, they're all based in homeland Russia. And it abandoned all those missiles. And so for, 30 years now, we've had a situation in Europe more stable because of the absence of these missiles.
Was it a mistake for us to withdraw from that treaty?
Well, this is a longer topic. What is clear is that Russia, about 5 or 6 years ago, began to develop a missile which violated the treaty. So it was in this range that was eliminated. We detected it. We approached the Russians repeatedly, calling them out on this violation. And they've now steadily proceeded and have now deployed, not just developed in sort of a experimental method, right? But have now deployed the first operational units armed with this capacity. So the Trump administration took the decision back in February to enter a 6-month period that the U.S., unless the Russians moved back into compliance, that the U.S. would leave the treaty. So here we are leaving one of the cornerstones of the nuclear sort
Seminal treaty.
Seminal treaty, one of the cornerstones of the whole fabric of nuclear arms control. And we're doing it in no small part because of the Russian violation. But in that world, it's difficult to imagine that we went from that to complete disarmament. Now, I want to just highlight one other point, though, on nuclear arms control. While the INF treaty that you and I have discussed is important, just behind it, due for updating, is the strategic arms control agreement between the U.S. and Russia. Well, it's called New START, right. But this was negotiated and agreed, successor to the SALT agreements back under Reagan and before, right? This treaty expires in January 2021, 2 months after our next national elections. So unless we get moving now to move into negotiations with the Russians, and this is a very important treaty because it sets limits on how many launchers each side can field. So how many missiles, how many aircraft, and so forth, right? It is not in our interest, I believe, especially in the wake of the INF treaty being dismissed, right? It's not in our interest to do likewise with the strategic weapons. But we're actually on a timeline which is very tight, especially considering that these months between now and January 21 are also our election period. So presidential administrations don't typically agree big arms control agreements in the course of a political campaign. So I'm concerned about the New START treaty.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbertv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
So we talked a little bit about China. What's the biggest challenge facing the United States when it comes to China? And also talk on the military side about the South China Sea.
The biggest competition that's already on us with regard to China is an economic competition. It's a market-based, pure and simple market-based economy. The challenge inside the economics are emerging technologies which will likely dominate the next several decades of our economy. So this is artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and so forth, where the Chinese government is in such close collaboration with Chinese industry, in some cases controlling Chinese industry, that it's a bit of an unlevel playing field. So the key of the competition is economics, and inside economics, it's these emerging technologies. It doesn't have to be a military competition. And I think that here we might actually rely on the advice of the famous Chinese military strategist, Sun Tzu, who said, the best way to win a war is to avoid fighting one, is to figure out a way politically to manage the competition between China and the US, economic and political competition, and not let that spill over into the military arena.
So what's your take on the fact that China is progressively becoming more authoritarian, where you now have a president who can serve for life, where you have an extraordinary surveillance capacity, monitoring capacity, censorship capacity, fueled in great part, unfortunately, by US technology, some acquired legally, some acquired illegally. What kind of obligation, if any, do we have? What kind of role do we have in addressing that? Or is it simply China's a sovereign nation and it's none of our business?
Well, China is a sovereign nation, but this connection between their very authoritarian form of government bleeds over into the economic competition, because the Chinese government can put Chinese government resources against commercial economic challenges in a way that our government cannot. And so, again, it presents this unlevel playing field economically, and that's a significant risk for us. I think, too, we have to understand that China's got, the reason China, President Xi, is at least in a part of the reason that he is so authoritarian, has declared himself in power for life, right, is that he recognizes that internal to China, he faces challenges, too. So they have rising expectations of a middle class that China never had before. They have severe air pollution. They have severe environmental problems. They have the Uyghur community, Muslim Chinese indigenous community that is suppressed, oppressed, and there are even reports of camping these folks out in concentration camps and so forth. So he's got some challenges internally.
And I want you to expand on that. I mean, we clearly have the evidence that over 1 million people are being held in detention camps. The Chinese call them re-education camps, as it were.
We've seen this game before, by other countries.
Exactly, and nothing like this is happening anywhere else on the planet on this scale. What is our obligation to those people? Is there anything we can do, knowing there are people not just being detained, separated from families, but being tortured, some cases killed as well? What can the United States do?
The first thing we have to do is stand publicly, strongly, and consistently in favor of democratic values and human rights. What we can't do is simply give China a pass and somehow fashion an economic arrangement, an economic relationship which is mutually beneficial, and then just tolerate anything that happens inside China.
But hasn't that been the policies of a number of past presidents willing to look the other way? This president, however, which I think is intriguing in the case of Donald Trump, he is willing, in terms of using economic power and control in his trade negotiations, to add these non-trade issues, or issues, for example, like intellectual property theft or acquisition, as it were, to his list of items to be negotiated.
But candidly, I don't see this administration trumpeting the values of human rights and so forth. So I do think we're walking past an obligation by the world's leading democracy to not only set the standard ourselves, and by the way, we should think seriously, are we today setting standards ourselves that we're satisfied with internally? You know, you can think of detention facilities for underage kids on our southern border. Is that America? Is that the America that not only can look itself in the mirror and in an introspective way feel proud that we're abiding by the values that founded our country, but is that the America that's setting the standard for others? And so one thing I think, there's work to be done here, right? There's work to be done internally so that we are a better, more consistent example. And then we can point to others who are violating. Right now, I'm not sure that we're in the best possible position in terms of our own adherence to human rights.
Well, but you don't have to be perfect in order to be able to criticize another country. I mean,
Apparently not, right? I mean, we do it all the time.
Right. But also, I mean, we incarcerate 2.25 million people in the United States, more than any other country in the world. I mean, China has fewer people incarcerated. I mean, I'm not going to compare a number being tortured or whatever. And they have a population, 4 times greater than us. So
perfection is, but this is not a conversation about perfection, right? I mean, so this is a conversation about values and standing up for who we are as Americans. And candidly, maybe one of the reasons Americans are not today absorbed by things like the encampment of the detention of the Uyghur Chinese population is that we've got pretty significant problems on our own front.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
Safely stop fires around your home. Introducing the Fire Ice XT 20-ounce aerosol canister. Fire Ice XT is an eco-friendly water-based fire suppressant gel. Unlike a traditional fire extinguisher, Fire Ice XT is a highly effective, non-toxic firefighting agent that is easy and safe to use around your home, family, and pets. Available at Amazon.com or call 800-924-4874.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
All right, speaking of some of the problems that have, I would say, made Americans weary of being involved internationally, that I think have really fueled Donald Trump's ability to say, hey, we're going to focus on us and not outside the country, are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. My take on the war in Iraq is that it was just a huge mistake on the part of the United States. Tell me whether or not I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong. I can't argue that position. It was a mistake based on flawed intelligence that was then, once we were in the execution mode, very poorly executed, especially in the early years, so between 2003 and sort of 2005. And you'll recall that there were some very dramatic, big mistakes made there. The United States, as sort of the proconsul of Iraq, we were controlling the scene after Baghdad had fallen. We decided in a rather narrow political process, not the kind of decision-making process that you and I were describing earlier in this show, right? But we decided to disband the Iraqi security forces, and we decided on a program of de-Baathification, meaning that anyone who had been under Saddam, had been a member of the Ba'ath Party, was not eligible for employment. So what this meant was tens of thousands of clerks, bureaucrats, teachers, lawyers, and so forth were dismissed. So all these people, both the army and the police, and the civil service, if you will, of Iraq, were unemployed. That greatly fueled the Iraqi insurgency. So we made some very bad mistakes in the course of that. And in the course of the first 3 years, we made enough mistakes that we paid for, and to some extent we're still paying for today.
What about Afghanistan?
Much different scene, right? I think that I think that basically President Obama had this right. Afghanistan was a war of necessity, as in a response, in quick response to the attacks on us on 9/11, right? And an attack that aimed to disarm Al-Qaeda, who brought us 9/11, and to ensure that the Taliban, who ruled Afghanistan at that time and had harbored bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, that they could not remain in power and attack us again. So that logic, that war logic, I think stands the test of time. That's in sharp contrast to Iraq. You know, Iraq did not attack us. Saddam was a problem. Saddam was a terrible leader for the Iraqi people, but we had a sanctions regime in place. We were controlling about 2/3 of his airspace to prevent him from assaulting his neighbors and assaulting his own people. It was not a great existence under sanctions in this air regime, but it wasn't war. And we, in a sense, passed on that containment strategy in Iraq, invaded, and we've been living with it ever since. So I think Iraq and Afghanistan are very different cases.
All right, so what do we do with Afghanistan today? We've been in Afghanistan longer than any other war in the history of the country. The Taliban has made in recent years substantial inroads. I mean, you talked about the negative aspect of the Taliban, but I think it's fairly obvious any kind of peace or settlement, any way we can extricate ourselves from Afghanistan means the Taliban has more than just a voice or a place at the table. We've had discussions with the Taliban, and the Taliban aren't stopping. And it seems to me with the current trajectory, the Taliban could take over the country.
So I don't have the same fear. I sense on the security front, the situation is really a stalemate. We're at gridlock. The Taliban, it's right, the Taliban, the insurgency, the Taliban, the former leaders of Afghanistan, want to displace the current government, the democratically elected government, but they don't really have the military strength to do so. And the margins we read about, marginal gains and losses we read about in the newspaper are really quite on the margin. Likewise, however, the Afghan government and its security forces, backed by us, and some 40 allies, by the way. NATO's still with us 18 years later in Afghanistan.
Not all of NATO, though.
Well, it's a NATO-led command, so it's a NATO formation. So the U.S. four-star commander in Afghanistan is dual-hatted. He wears a NATO hat and a U.S. hat.
Head of the international forces.
That's right, that's right. That coalition also can't eradicate the Taliban. So we're at gridlock militarily. We're also right now, unfortunately, at gridlock politically. So we have the American envoy, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, a friend of mine, a colleague, now holding a series of talks with Taliban leaders outside of Afghanistan, right, about the potential that the Taliban could return to Afghanistan and under the conditions that they would ensure that Al-Qaeda does not return with them, right? And with the incentive that American forces would eventually leave. So that's kind of interesting. But that's not sufficient to make a durable agreement. The durable agreement has got to be made politically between the Afghan government and the Taliban, and so far, that negotiation is also stalemated. They are not meeting. So you have both a stalemate on the ground militarily and a stalemate politically between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And if that weren't bad enough, you in effect have a third stalemate, and that's the stalemate among regional players. So the role of Pakistan, most important here, but Afghanistan has other unhelpful neighbors, Iran to the west, and the Central Asian states and Russia to the north. So it's a very multi-tiered, complex problem that Zalmay Khalilzad is doing his best to tackle. And if anybody can do it, I've got trust in Ambassador Khalilzad, but it is a very tough nut to crack.
So what is your prediction in terms of how much longer we'll be in Afghanistan?
My prediction is that in order to ensure that al-Qaeda, the original reason we went to Afghanistan, does not return, right? And now, increasingly, an emerging component of the Islamic State. So remember the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, there's a local franchise of the Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In order to ensure that those transnational terrorists who could, if they returned to Afghanistan, unfettered, uncontrolled, could attack us, I think there's cause for us to retain some counterterrorism strike potential in Afghanistan or nearby, maybe just outside Afghanistan, for the foreseeable future. The challenge is that in order to get to that point, the Taliban and the Afghan government have to reach a compromise in terms of sharing power. This does not mean, and it does not foretell, a return of the Taliban to power. I don't think anybody, well, except perhaps elements of the Taliban, want that or would tolerate that. But this is the art of the deal, right? This is the art of diplomacy. This is the art of fashioning a compromise, and we're just not there yet.
All right, quick question on the Department of Defense. We spend approximately $1 trillion, if you include Veterans Administration, DOD, the atomic energy element, atomic nuclear weapons in the Department of Energy as well. At the same time, we spend only about less than, well, basically 5% of that on the Department of State. Would it make sense, as a military person, would it make sense to move some of those DOD resources, and I'm talking about maybe, 1%, 5%, to the Department of State so that we can do more in terms of having ambassadors, having the Peace Corps expanded, those types of more people-to-people approach?
Couldn't agree more. I don't know in the community of active and retired senior military officers of all services, Army, Navy, Air Force, among the 2, 3, and 4-star officers. I don't know a single officer who would argue against that position. Why? Because in the last 20 years, we have 20 years of experience that we are most effective as a military on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan when we have capable civilian partners. And we need civilian partners to fashion political arrangements like the ones we were challenged by in Afghanistan, but also development experts so that the people in these countries understand that there's a better life waiting for them if they cooperate and move along with us. And we also need regional experts who bring with them, civilian experts, a deep understanding of these regional problems so that we don't get ourselves immersed in a challenge somewhere, in a gunfight, without understanding the economics, the political culture, the neighborhood in which this fight is playing out. And wherever we economize on this, wherever we economize on the civil-military teamwork, we pay a heavy price. So the military is all in terms of supporting our civilian colleagues.
All right. Doug, thank you so much.
Not at all. I enjoyed it.
All right. That was General and Ambassador Douglas Lute. This is the end of part 2 of our special 2-part series. Make sure you watch part 1. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.